The first time Marissa Moore died, it was quiet, as if the universe whispered rather than roared. She had been driving home from her job as a school teacher, humming along to the soft strains of a gospel hymn playing on the radio. The world outside her car blurred into a twilight haze, the warmth of the setting sun casting a golden glow across the fields. Then, without warning, the deer appeared, its wide, startled eyes locking onto hers in an instant that felt eternal. She swerved to avoid it, her tires skidding on the slick asphalt. The next thing she knew, the world went dark. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. When Marissa opened her eyes, she was no longer in her car. Instead, she stood in a vast expanse of light so brilliant it should have blinded her. Yet her eyes did not burn. The air around her was thick with an otherworldly presence, weighty yet comforting. A figure emerged from the light, robed in radiance, his eyes piercing yet kind. Though he did not speak, she understood his every word. "It is not yet your time," the being seemed to say. In the blink of an eye, she was pulled back into the physical world, gasping for air as paramedics worked frantically over her crumpled body. Marissa had no memory of the crash itself, only the profound peace of that glowing realm and the silent, commanding figure. Weeks later, as she recovered in the hospital, Marissa couldn't shake the vision of the man in the light. She prayed for clarity, seeking answers in scripture and consulting with her pastor, who assured her that she had experienced a brush with heaven. But deep inside, Marissa felt there was more to the story, something that had been left unsaid, hovering just out of reach. The second death came 3 years later. Marissa had just celebrated her 40th birthday, surrounded by family and friends in the warmth of her suburban home. Life had begun to feel normal again, though the memory of her first near-death experience lingered like a shadow at the edge of her consciousness. On an otherwise ordinary morning, she collapsed suddenly in her kitchen while making coffee. Her heart stopped before the ambulance even arrived. This time, the journey to the other side was far less serene. Marissa found herself standing at the edge of a dark chasm, the air cold and heavy with despair. Shadows writhed below her, their forms indistinct but menacing. A voice called out, one she recognized immediately as the same figure from her first encounter, but this time his tone was stern, even sorrowful. "You have been warned," he said, his words resonating within her like a tolling bell. Marissa tried to speak, to ask what she had done wrong, but the figure raised a hand, silencing her. Images began to flash before her, moments from her life that she had buried or ignored. She saw herself snapping at a stranger in a grocery store, rolling her eyes at a homeless man asking for change, neglecting to call her widowed mother as often as she should have. None of the offenses seemed monumental, yet together they painted a picture of selfishness, a life not lived in alignment with the love and grace she claimed to uphold. "You must change," the voice said, filled with both authority and compassion. "There is little time." Before she could respond, Marissa felt a force yanking her back to her body. She awoke to find herself in the ICU, her family huddled around her bed in tearful relief. But this time, the message she had received lingered like a weight on her chest. She knew she had been given a second chance to make things right, yet the specifics of how to do so eluded her. Marissa threw herself into her faith with renewed vigor. She volunteered at homeless shelters, reconciled with estranged friends, and became the cornerstone of her church's outreach programs. But despite her efforts, a deep unease gnawed at her soul, as though she had missed something crucial. She prayed constantly, pleading for guidance, yet the heavens remained silent. The third death was the most shocking. Marissa had been at a charity event helping organize a fundraiser for underprivileged children. The evening was a resounding success, filled with laughter, applause, and a sense of communal joy. As Marissa stood to give a speech, she felt a sharp pain in her chest. Her vision blurred, and she collapsed to the floor, her body crumpling like a marionette with its strings cut. This time, Marissa awoke in a place she could only describe as desolation incarnate. It was neither heaven nor hell, but a barren gray wasteland that stretched endlessly in every direction. The air was suffocatingly still, and the silence pressed against her eardrums like a deafening roar. The figure from her previous experiences appeared again, but this time his face was shadowed, his light dimmed, his expression was grave, his presence commanding an almost unbearable weight. "You have not understood," he said, his voice carrying an edge of sorrow that made Marissa's heart ache. Marissa fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she begged, "tell me what I need to do." The figure gestured, and the gray wasteland transformed into a vivid scene of humanity's suffering. She saw children crying from hunger, women abused and broken, wars raging, and countless souls lost in despair. Then, the vision shifted, showing her own life once more. This time, however, it highlighted not just her actions, but the ripple effects they had caused. She saw how her words had both lifted and wounded others, how her generosity had inspired some but also bred resentment in those who felt overlooked. Every choice, every action seemed to echo infinitely, intertwining with the lives of others in ways she could barely comprehend. "Your purpose is not merely to act, but to awaken," the figure said. "You are called to be a voice, a beacon, not just in deeds, but in truth. The world is asleep in its selfishness, and time is running out." Marissa was overwhelmed by the magnitude of the message. She wanted to protest, to argue that she had tried her best, but deep down she knew the figure was right. Her efforts, though earnest, had been too small, too focused on immediate results rather than the broader, eternal truth she was meant to share. The figure's voice softened, yet it carried an urgency that made her tremble. "You will return once more, but only to deliver this message. After that, your time will be done." Marissa awoke to a flurry of activity in the hospital. Doctors and nurses shouting as they stabilized her once lifeless body. Her family wept openly, clinging to her as if they could anchor her to the earth. But Marissa felt no joy in her survival. Instead, she was consumed by the weight of the mission she had been given. From that day forward, Marissa became a woman possessed by purpose. She traveled across the country speaking in churches, schools, and community centers. Her story captivated audiences, but it was her message that left them shaken. She spoke of the interconnectedness of all lives, the ripple effects of every choice, and the urgent need for humanity to wake from its spiritual slumber. Her words were raw, unapologetic, and often uncomfortable, challenging people to examine their lives with brutal honesty. Marissa's message was not one of condemnation, but of hope, a reminder that it was not too late to change, to realign with the love and grace that Jesus embodied. Yet she did not shy away from the harsher truths of her visions. She described the desolation she had seen, the darkness that threatened to consume humanity if it continued down its path of selfishness and apathy. Her speech came just a year after her third death. Standing before a packed stadium, Marissa's voice rang out with a clarity and power that seemed to transcend her small frame. "We are running out of time," she said, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "Each of us carries a piece of the divine, a spark meant to light the way for others. But we have allowed that light to dim, consumed by our own fears and desires. I am here to tell you that we must awaken, not tomorrow, not someday, now." When Marissa returned to her hotel that night, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had done what she was called to do. As she lay down to sleep, she whispered a final prayer of gratitude and surrender. The next morning, Marissa's family found her lifeless body, her face serene and her hands clasped in prayer. Though her physical presence was gone, her message lived on, echoing in the hearts of those who had heard her story. For years to come, people would recount the tale of the woman who died 3 times and returned with a message that changed lives, a call to awaken, to love, and to live with purpose before it was too late. Marissa Moore's story did not end with her death. In many ways, it was only the beginning. Her passing sparked a movement, a ripple that spread far beyond what even she could have imagined. The people who had listened to her speak, those who had felt the unmistakable weight of her words and the urgency of her message, began to share her story with others. It was no longer just her voice that carried the warning. It was a collective outcry, a growing wave of awakening. In small towns and bustling cities alike, conversations shifted. Families discussed Marissa's visions over dinner tables, their children asking questions that parents struggled to answer. What would happen if humanity did not change? Were their own lives aligned with the purpose Marissa had so passionately described? Pastors preached about her journey from their pulpits, drawing parallels between her experiences and biblical warning. Her story became a modern parable, a call for self-reflection and repentance that transcended religious boundaries. The most remarkable aspect of Marissa's legacy was how it brought together people from all walks of life. Those who had never set foot in a church found themselves drawn to her story. It wasn't just the religious who resonated with her message, but also the skeptics, the curious, and the disillusioned. For them, her experiences spoke to something deeper, something universal, the need to find meaning in a world increasingly dominated by chaos and division. As Marissa's message gained traction, it began to evolve. Artists painted vivid depictions of the realm she described, the radiant light of her first death, the shadowy chasm of her second, and the desolate wasteland of her third. These paintings hung in galleries and churches, stirring emotions in those who saw them. Writers crafted books and essays, dissecting her words and weaving them into philosophical and theological frameworks. Musicians composed hymns and ballads inspired by her journey, their melodies echoing with both hope and urgency. One of the most striking interpretations came from a group of young filmmakers who created a documentary about Marissa's life. They traveled to her hometown, interviewed her family and friends, and compiled recordings of her speeches. The resulting film, Awaken, the Marissa Moore story, premiered to packed theaters and quickly became a cultural phenomenon. It was raw and unflinching, capturing the intensity of her experiences and the profound impact they had on those who heard her speak. The film did not shy away from the darker elements of her visions, but it ended on a hopeful note, emphasizing the possibility of redemption and change. As the documentary gained worldwide acclaim, Marissa's story reached an even broader audience. Social media platforms buzzed with discussions, hashtags, and viral posts sharing excerpts of her speeches. Her face became an icon of awakening, her piercing gaze and calm demeanor symbolizing the urgent call to action she had delivered. People began to form groups and communities dedicated to living out her message. They called themselves Awakeners and pledged to examine their lives, spread kindness, and inspire change wherever they went. But not everyone welcomed Marissa's message. There were those who dismissed her experiences as fabrications or hallucinations. Skeptics labeled her a charlatan, accusing her of exploiting people's fears for fame or influence. Scientists debated the neurological and psychological explanations for near-death experiences, arguing that Marissa's visions were the result of a dying brain rather than divine revelation. The debates grew heated, filling television panels and online forums with both impassioned believers and vocal critics. Despite the controversy, Marissa's story continued to touch lives in profound ways. One of the most moving accounts came from a man named Elijah Carter, who had been on the verge of ending his life when he stumbled upon a video of her final speech. Something in her words broke through his despair, and he found the strength to reach out for help. Elijah's story, in turn, inspired others to share their own struggles and find solace in the community that had formed around Marissa's message. In the years following her death, the ripple effects of her journey became increasingly tangible. The communities that had embraced her teachings began organizing large-scale efforts to combat the suffering she had described. They started food drives, built shelters for the homeless, and funded schools in impoverished areas. These initiatives were not driven by guilt or obligation, but by a genuine desire to make a difference, to be the light Marissa had implored them to become. Among the most significant transformations was the impact her story had on interpersonal relationships. Families that had been fractured by years of conflict found ways to reconcile. Inspired by Marissa's emphasis on the ripple effects of every action, people began to approach their daily interactions with more mindfulness, recognizing the potential for both harm and healing in their words and deeds. Strangers offered kindness to one another, small acts of generosity multiplying in unexpected and beautiful ways. Marissa's message also resonated with global leaders, some of whom cited her story in speeches addressing issues such as climate change, poverty, and war. They spoke of the interconnectedness she had described, emphasizing that humanity's challenges could not be solved in isolation. Inspired by her words, coalitions formed to tackle problems that had long seemed insurmountable. While progress was slow and imperfect, it was undeniable that her story had sparked a shift in perspective. Yet, as the movement grew, so did the weight of her warnings. The urgency of her message loomed large, a reminder that time was not infinite. Awakeners often spoke of feeling both inspired and burdened, caught between hope for a better future and fear of the consequences if humanity failed to heed Marissa's call. This tension fueled their efforts, driving them to push harder, dream bigger, and refuse to give in to despair. One of the most poignant moments in the years after Marissa's death came when her daughter, Grace, decided to carry on her mother's mission. Grace had been a teenager when Marissa died, struggling to understand the magnitude of what her mother had experienced. But as she grew older, she began to see the profound truth in her mother's words. Grace became a powerful voice in her own right, blending her mother's teachings with her unique perspective as someone who had witnessed the personal cost of such a calling. Grace often spoke about the humanity of her mother, emphasizing that Marissa had been an ordinary woman thrust into an extraordinary role. She wasn't perfect, Grace would say during her speeches, but that's the point. None of us are. What matters is that we try, that we keep striving to be better, to love more deeply, and to live with purpose. Under Grace's leadership, the Awakener movement evolved into something even more profound. It became a network of interconnected efforts, each focused on addressing specific aspects of the suffering Marissa had described. Some groups worked on environmental restoration, planting trees and cleaning oceans. Others focused on mental health, creating safe spaces for people to share their struggles and find support. Still others dedicated themselves to combating inequality, advocating for policies that uplifted the marginalized and oppressed. As these efforts grew, so did the stories of transformation. There was the former gang member who became a mentor to at-risk youth, the estranged siblings who reconciled after decades of silence, and the corporate executive who left behind a lucrative career to start a nonprofit. Each story added another layer to Marissa's legacy, proof that her message had the power to inspire real and lasting change. But perhaps the most profound change was the one that could not be measured, the shift in consciousness that rippled through humanity. People began to see themselves not as isolated individuals, but as part of a larger, interconnected whole. They recognized that their choices mattered, not just for themselves, but for everyone around them. This awareness brought both a sense of responsibility and a deep, abiding hope. Years turned into decades, and Marissa's story became a legend, passed down from one generation to the next. Her name was spoken with reverence, not as a saint or a savior, but as a woman who had dared to speak the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it was. The world she left behind was far from perfect, but it was undeniably better, shaped by the countless lives she had touched. And though Marissa was gone, her message remained, a beacon in the darkness, a call to awaken, and a reminder that even the smallest acts of love and kindness could change the world. The echoes of Marissa Moore's life continued to reverberate long after her passing, a crescendo of inspiration that refused to fade. The impact of her message was far-reaching, and as her story grew, it became not just a tale of transformation, but a global phenomenon that reshaped countless lives and communities. What began as a personal testimony evolved into a movement so expansive and profound that it challenged the very foundations of modern society. In the decades that followed Marissa's death, the Awakener movement became a defining force for change. Its adherents, now numbering in the millions, adopted her teachings as a guide to navigate a world fraught with turmoil and division. The ethos of the movement, awakening to interconnectedness, living with intentionality, and embracing love as a guiding principle, served as a rallying cry for those seeking meaning in an increasingly chaotic world. As the Awakener movement matured, it began to manifest in ways that went beyond individual actions. Entire communities were transformed by the principles Marissa had articulated. Small towns and urban neighborhoods alike adopted policies rooted in collaboration, equity, and sustainability. These communities became laboratories for new ways of living, where decisions were made not based on profit or convenience, but on the collective well-being of all their inhabitants. One such community, called Lumina, became the movement's unofficial headquarters. Located in a remote region of Montana, Lumina was a place where Marissa's teachings were put into practice on every level. The town was entirely self-sustaining, its energy sourced from renewable resources, its economy based on shared labor and resources, and its governance rooted in consensus. Visitors from around the world came to Lumina to witness this experiment in action, and many left inspired to implement similar changes in their own cities and towns. In Lumina's central square stood a monument dedicated to Marissa, a striking sculpture of her outstretched hand reaching toward a beam of light. Beneath it, an inscription read, "Awaken not for yourself alone, but for all who follow." The monument became a place of pilgrimage, drawing thousands each year who sought solace, guidance, or simply the courage to continue their own journeys. The movement's influence also extended into the realm of education. Awakener principles were incorporated into school curricula, teaching children the values of empathy, critical thinking, and social responsibility. Students learned not just about history and science, but about the ripple effects of their choices, both positive and negative. In classrooms around the world, Marissa's story was told as an example of how one life, when lived with purpose, could ignite a revolution of the spirit. But the Awakener movement was not without its challenges. As it grew in scope, it faced resistance from those who felt threatened by its ideals. Political leaders, corporate executives, and religious institutions who saw the movement as a challenge to their power sought to discredit it. Some accused the movement of being utopian or naive, while others spread conspiracy theories about its origins and intentions. Marissa's visions, once a source of hope and inspiration, were dissected and questioned by skeptics who dismissed them as hallucinations or fabrications. Despite the opposition, the movement persisted, its followers undeterred. They believed that the resistance they faced was a testament to the power of their message. "Every great change comes with struggle," Grace Moore often said in her speeches, "but struggle is the fire in which we are refined." Grace herself became a towering figure in the movement, her voice carrying the same clarity and conviction as her mother's. Yet she brought her own perspective, one shaped by her unique experiences and the lessons she had learned from witnessing her mother's journey. Grace often spoke about the importance of humility, reminding her audience that awakening was not a destination but a lifelong process. One of Grace's most impactful initiatives was the creation of the Awakener Institute, an organization dedicated to training individuals to carry Marissa's message into the world. The Institute offered programs in leadership, community organizing, and conflict resolution, equipping people with the tools they needed to effect change. Graduates of the program went on to become teachers, activists, and leaders in their own right, spreading the movement's ideals far and wide. The Awakener Institute also became a hub for research into near-death experiences, spirituality, and the interconnectedness of human life. Scientists, theologians, and philosophers came together to explore the mysteries of existence, inspired by the questions Marissa's story had raised. While many of their findings remained inconclusive, the collaboration itself was a testament to the power of her legacy. It brought together people from disparate fields and beliefs in pursuit of a common understanding. As the Awakener movement continued to grow, its influence began to reshape global institutions. Governments, pressured by the sheer number of people demanding change, began to adopt policies aligned with the movement's principles. Climate change, once a polarizing issue, became a unifying cause as leaders recognized the urgency of preserving the planet for future generations. Economic systems were reimagined to prioritize equity and sustainability, with wealth redistribution and universal basic income becoming mainstream practices in many countries. The arts also flourished under the influence of the Awakener movement. Writers, filmmakers, musicians, and visual artists drew inspiration from Marissa's story, creating works that captured the depth and complexity of her message. These creations not only entertained, but also provoked thought and reflection, challenging audiences to examine their own lives and choices. One particularly powerful film, Eternal Ripples, portrayed Marissa's experiences in vivid detail, blending elements of fantasy and realism to bring her visions to life. The film won multiple awards and was credited with reigniting global interest in her story. Even as the world began to change, the movement never lost sight of its core mission, awakening individuals to their potential to make a difference. Personal transformation remained at the heart of the Awakener philosophy, with followers encouraged to examine their lives daily and strive for continuous growth. Support groups and mentorship programs flourished, providing spaces for people to share their struggles and celebrate their progress. One of the most profound legacies of the Awakener movement was its impact on interfaith dialogue. Marissa's message, while rooted in her own Christian faith, resonated with people of all religious backgrounds, and even those with none. Her emphasis on universal love and interconnectedness bridged divides that had long seemed insurmountable. In cities around the world, interfaith councils were established, bringing together leaders from diverse traditions to collaborate on initiatives that served the common good. As the century progressed, the Awakener movement became woven into the fabric of society. It was no longer seen as a radical or fringe idea, but as a guiding principle for how humanity could coexist and thrive. While challenges and setbacks continued to arise, the movement's followers remained steadfast, drawing strength from the knowledge that they were part of something greater than themselves. Marissa Moore's story, once a single thread in the tapestry of human history, had become a luminous thread that connected countless lives across time and space. Her message, delivered with such urgency and passion, had sparked a revolution not of power or politics, but of the soul. And as the world moved forward, it carried her legacy as a reminder of what was possible when people chose to awaken, to love, and to live with purpose. The focus shifted inward, encouraging individuals to not only act outwardly, but also to confront their deepest fears, biases, and unhealed wounds. Awakening was no longer merely about changing the world. It was also about healing the self. Therapists, spiritual leaders, and mindfulness practitioners began integrating Awakener principles into their practices, guiding people through the process of identifying the roots of their pain and transforming it into compassion and strength. In this new phase, the movement emphasized balance. While Marissa's initial message had ignited urgent action in the face of global suffering, the leaders who carried on her legacy understood the importance of sustainability, not just in terms of the environment, but in how people engaged with the world. Burnout, a common challenge among activists and changemakers, became a central topic of discussion. New teachings emerged within the movement, highlighting the importance of rest, reflection, and joy as essential components of an awakened life. Communities around the world began to embrace rituals of connection, blending ancient traditions with modern insights. In one city, residents gathered weekly in a shared garden to meditate and share stories of how they were implementing Marissa's teachings in their daily lives. In another, a group of artists created a mural depicting scenes from her visions, inviting passers-by to contribute their own symbols and messages of hope. These rituals became more than acts of solidarity. They became acts of collective healing, reminding people that awakening was not a solitary journey, but one walked together. One of the most significant breakthroughs of this period came in the field of neuroscience, where scientists began to study the physical and psychological effects of living in alignment with awakener principles. Initial research revealed striking results. Individuals who actively practiced empathy, mindfulness, and intentional living exhibited increased neural connectivity in areas of the brain associated with emotional regulation and resilience. These findings further validated the transformative power of Marissa's message and inspired more people to adopt the movement's teachings. Another powerful development during this time was the emergence of the Ripple Pledge, a global initiative that invited people to commit to creating small, meaningful ripples of change in their everyday lives. The pledge, inspired by Marissa's vision of interconnectedness, emphasized the cumulative power of small acts of kindness, generosity, and courage. Participants received journals to document their daily ripples and were encouraged to share their experiences through an online platform that connected pledges from across the world. The initiative sparked countless stories of unexpected connections, from a young boy starting a recycling program in his school to an elderly woman teaching others how to grow their own food in an urban apartment complex. The arts continued to play a pivotal role in amplifying Marissa's legacy, evolving in ways that mirrored the deepening of the movement. Writers began exploring speculative fiction inspired by her visions, imagining futures shaped by humanity's collective awakening or its refusal to change. Musicians composed symphonies and choral works that sought to capture the awe and urgency of her encounters with the divine. These creations, while diverse in form and style, shared a common purpose: to inspire introspection and evoke a sense of the sacred in everyday life. Global leaders also began to approach their responsibilities with a newfound sense of humility and interconnectedness. Many cited Marissa's teachings in their speeches, using her story as a moral compass to guide their decisions. At international summits, discussions shifted from competition to collaboration, with nations working together to address challenges such as poverty, climate change, and inequality. While these efforts were far from perfect, they represented a significant departure from the divisive politics of earlier decades, reflecting the slow but steady influence of the Awakener movement. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the woman's experience and message from Jesus? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.